So today, for our chapter 1 mini lecture, I wanted to take the first section of the chapter, which is called Psychology's Roots, and talk about it a little bit. So the first thing that I want to note about this chapter is it's mainly about this section of the chapter is it's mainly about behavior and what exactly behavior is. And although there's no real definition, we can make an educated guess about behavior based on human evolution and our ancestors, which I think is very interesting. So our ancestors play a vital role and showed us a lot about the behavioral sciences and psychological sciences. And we use those theories even to this day. So our ancestors paid attention to the behavior of people through other animals. They tended to use animals as sources of learning and understanding of the behavior of human minds. Our ancestors did not have the technologies or luxuries that we have now. They did not have many medical advancements to look inside the brain or understand more about the brain and how our body works and the behavior of our body. So the environment was very important to their survival and their understanding. This environment includes the world around them and animals. One example of kind of the psychological science here is the birds in New Guinea example. So the first Western biologist to systematically classify bird species in New Guinea found 137 different species in an area, but when he brought this up to the local inhabitants of the area, they weren't surprised at all because they had themselves found 136 different names for those birds. So this just goes to show the whole relation to animals that our ancestors had and the way that they used animals. Another important note of our ancestors and evolutionary history is strangers. So today in our lives, we tend to be surrounded by strangers all the time. We meet people we don't know. We walk around. We see people we don't know at all. It's hypothesized that we can only keep track of 150 people and relationships on a daily basis. So we're surrounded by strangers all the time, essentially. However, in our evolutionary history and to our ancestors, they did not have to worry about strangers at all. It's important to note that our ancestors often lived with people they knew. In their towns, in their villages, in their areas, they knew the people around them, and they didn't really have to worry about false identifications, which is something that we unfortunately have to do now. So that's important to note. Strangers, I think, is an important example of our evolutionary history and our behavior surrounding, uncomfortableness as strangers can give us or anything like that. The next section of the first part of chapter 1 was the early Greeks. So the first Greek figure that I want to mention is Aristotle. So in general, Aristotle was a keen observer and he knew a lot. However, he was wrong about some things. I think it's important to note the most prominent thing is that he did not think the brain was important. Obviously, we know now, and it's been known for some time, that the brain is actually very important, to our behavior, to our physical body, and mentally as well. That's one thing he was very wrong about. So some things he observed were kind of important and essentially about pregnant women. So if a pregnant woman had a lot of morning sickness or was just generally sick, it was said that the child would be a girl. And then if they weren't getting sick, it would be a boy. And if the mother drank a lot, the child was mentally ill or mentally disabled, which actually we can physiologically think about as well today. Aristotle also pointed out that our senses can deceive us, which I think is extremely interesting to notice because I never really thought about it before, but I think it's important to look at the waterfall illusion for this. So the waterfall illusion is that if you are looking at a waterfall in nature and seeing the water, trickle down and use gravitational forces to go down a hill or whatever, and you look at that waterfall for some time, and then you look away at a stationary object, your senses can tell you that that stationary object is actually moving. So your eyes will deceive you and show that stationary object as moving around, up, down, or whatever. And I think that's really interesting. The next Greek figure I want to point out is Plato. So he also shared an interest in the sensory illusions, but this is also because he knew that people hallucinated, and hallucinations are just generally our senses deceiving us and telling us something is there when it's not. But most importantly, Plato created the parable of the cave, which just generally is about the shadows of the world and how they're important. The parable of the cave is a part of Western tradition and Western idealism now. The next Greek figure is Rene Descartes. So, most importantly, Rene was a dualist, which means that he believed in a non corporeal mind and body. So, non corporeal means not material or not physically there, and so he believed in both. He also inspired psychophysics and believed that the nervous system was like a machine. So just generally, when we think about our nervous system, it is a bunch of things working together to create something for our body. So when he thought about the nervous system, he thought about a machine. So a machine has a bunch of wires and cables, everything working together to create a certain thing or a certain product. So that's important as well. And then we have John Locke. So John Locke essentially was an expressionist who believed that newborns had a blank slate or a tabula rasa. And this means that they could essentially write anything they wanted. This means that they could create their own life and become whatever they wanted, whether it be a lawyer, a doctor, or a philosopher. The next Greek figure is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was the co-discoverer of natural selection. And he believed that evolutionarily humans were naturally selected based on what they could do or if they came out on top. Charles Darwin also believed that behaviors had beginnings in earlier ancestors, and like the continuum of physical traits, he believed that there was a continuum of behaviors as well. So then his chief contribution was probably his novel, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. And I wanted to include this because I think it's especially interesting, the mention of man and animals again, and the relation that animals have to our behavior. The last Greek figure I want to mention is Margaret Floy Washburn. She's talked about later in chapter 1, but I think essentially she's just a psychologist who described the behaviors of animals and related them back to the human mind. And once again, it's important, I think, to note the use of animals and the human mind and how they related again. So this relates back, I'm going to scroll back here, to our first point when I talked about ancestors paying attention to the behavior of people and other animals. I think it's interesting to see how this kind of theory and this idea travels throughout many psychologists throughout time. And that's it for my section of chapter 1.